Welcome, everybody. Week 13th. Today, we will talk about philosophy as a basic approach toward neuroscience. And we are moving toward the very last portion of this semester. We'll be talking about the triple S model. So we're talking about the self, soul, and spirit. And we will venture into some aspects of the most important subfields within neuroscience that we haven't covered yet, starting with critical neuroscience from a broader perspective. So without further ado, let's begin.
Listing the following models, methods to better understand the mind-body connection, we could begin with the scientific method, which is the evidence-based, the observational, empirical. We mentioned that in regard to modernism, to positivism, and to postmodernism, and the Age of Enlightenment, and the golden rule, so to speak, of double-blind, case control, randomized trials, the principle of falsifiability, the hierarchy of evidence. And then the second one will be the philosophical model and method, since the focus of this chapter is philosophy as basic approach toward neuroscience. And we mentioned this multiple times in the context of natural philosophy, that this overall understanding of the field underlying science. So philosophical model and methods, each of which depends on multiple positions, and we will see whether we should embrace or not a how can I define this, a relativist perspective. And then third, the artistic model and method, which is something that might be surprising to some of you in a course on neuroscience, including theories of perceptions to art movements and philosophies, to the sheer enjoyment through the senses. So the importance of understanding through our own perspective, our pleasure even. We'll talk about that in the second part of this chapter, as well as artistic model and method to the social, political, the sense or meaning making, the affirming, affirmative, activating, and even activist component of performance art. We talked about this, especially in connection to society and the understanding of current issues. The fourth one will be actually the spiritual, meditative, transcendental, religious model and method. This again with special reference to mystical experiences, but also NDEs, OOBEs, alternate state of consciousness, neurotheology, etc. This is fundamental because we're talking about mind-body connection. So when we will discuss the difference or similarity between mind, body, spirit, and soul, this will be a very important perspective to take into account. We can relate to John Gray's view on contemporary science in relation to Kurzweil's singularity, which in modern times resembles what magic was for ancient civilization. So provided a general sense of hope toward the achievement of eternal life. Now, since we mentioned Hegel, think of this perspective. So according to the German philosopher, the absolute knowledge presents itself, though not in a conceptual form proper of the German concept of Begriff, the concept, right? But in a pictorial form, okay? So imagine this imaginative, figurative, transcendental form as described by the Vorstellung. This will be the term that Hegel uses, this representation, okay? So it's a poetic, imaginative, creative expression, almost idiomatic, to represent oneself, to imagine a possible future outcome, the Stell dir vor. It's a pictorial form which is essential to understand why we are arguing that philosophy can be a basic approach toward neuroscience. It is not contrary to the scientific method. It's not contrary to the scientific basis of laboratory science, but it's something that goes beyond that. The appropriate philosophical methodology should thus follow a formal dialectical process, keep in mind Hegelian dialectics, but should engage in an introspective rememorization, recollection. We talked about introspection last week, and this is connection to memory, recollection, and Erinnerung, which will be the original term, this speculative philosophy. Think about Giambattista Vico, for instance. Now, there could be a criticism to this, because one might argue, why adding this philosophical, transcendental, even religious perspective to neuroscience? We should stick to empirical science, to evidence-based science, as if the former is opposite to the latter. Well, criticism to traditional religions often identify the perceived delusional, illusional aspect of belief and practice, as in, well, please, let's remove anything religious from the discussion on science, because, first of all, we don't have any way to prove it, beside maybe coercion, and this is really contrary to the ethics of science. And also, you cannot force someone to believe in the absence of evidence, in spite of evidence, some of the atheist philosopher would suggest. Now, delusion, illusion associated with religion. Now, in this view, revealed religion is an illusion, because its truth is always something that has to be represented, non-conceptualized. Now, this is not necessarily a criticism, however, okay, because the view that we just mentioned in regard to Vico and Hegel says that the content of religion is correct, but the form is wrong. And so this is not something that is understood from a perspective of concept alone, okay? But it has to be represented. The representation, to a very big extent, it's a dramatic representation. It's a poetic representation. It's recreation. It's liturgical in nature. It's remanifesting in the present time something that is, by definition, outside of space and time. Now, this certainly defines the problematic relation between illusion, representation, perception, conceptualization, and revelation of metaphysical messages, and even the phenomenology of psychiatric events. We talked about this in regard to the criticism to this neuroscientistic approach that often Western psychiatry utilizes. Now, definition of manifestation or epiphany are very important in analyzing the cognitive rational perspective as preferred method of investigation of such issues. To provide an example here, a rationalization or cognitivation of the figure or the image of a divine being, or of the Spirit, the Holy Ghost even, would not make sense at all, according to this analysis, to Verene, then Verene's interpretation of Hegel, because of the nature and substance of this spiritual entity. It does not even make sense to rationalize, to use cognitive approaches, which are in the end what we use in science, in evidence-based science, to better understand it. To continue with our analysis here, we'll stick to Hegel. There is a term that he utilizes, the beautiful soul. And keep in mind what we said about this connection between beauty in an aesthetic sense, perceptual sense, which has to do again with our perception. If this perception is accurate, it's in the right place. You could say it's not sick, it's not disoriented, it's not disordered. This beauty is both, again, aesthetic as well as ethic. Okay? So the beautiful soul is both the very intuition of the divine as well as the divine intuition of itself. Keep in mind this phenomenal aspect of human beings, in the sense that separates them from other animals, this recognition of themselves as self, as thinking self, we could say, to push a bit the Cartesian understanding, the thing, therefore I am. So the divine intuition of itself, the self own acts in juxtaposition, contraposition to what was content, the content in a cognitive sense of the religious perspective. Now, we could also mention, since we will talk about neurolinguistics, that this is the reason, beyond the divine nature of language, which is something you can find throughout the ancient world, from our current alphabet, alpha and beta, to the abjad, to the runes, to the Egyptian hieroglyphs, to the pictograms, the hierograms, etc., etc., etc. Because the divine nature of language, learned at the level of the meaning, das Meinen in German, because of its connection to poetry, and the fact that in the end it leads to philosophy, to a communion with itself. Last week we talked about the unio mystica, the mystical union, right? So the the reason beyond the divine nature of language is learned at the level of meaning, since the real cannot be said, cannot be uttered. This is a phenomenal analogy. Now, one of the things that we also have to keep in mind is some of the cognitive, or rather biased cognitive scientific approaches to making science real nowadays, and this is connected to this progressive split into multiple subfields. Now, this course analyzes multiple subfields of neuroscience, but think about what happens in science in terms of dividing multiple subfields where the connection between these fields would be more important. Well, this has a direct impact on funding research studies, to think of one example, and for instance, application toward grants, right? So if the amount of money is limited, if you apply to private grants or to the NIH, for instance, and everyone wants the money, every researcher needs the money to perform research, well, one of the best ways to access these funds is exactly to further subdivide the fields of science, field of medicine, which in turn promotes the idea that it's actually better to know a lot more about a very limited area of investigation. Now, this is not necessarily a bad thing in itself. We mentioned this throughout this course, that nobody can be an expert in everything. But if this ultimately results into a lack of communication between fields, this turns into a lack of perception of the bigger picture, and it's only an economical factor, not a really scientific one. Because what does it mean to be an expert? Yet again, we mentioned this, an expert is someone who experiences, right? It's someone who has or makes an experience. So despite the fact that science has to account for the subjective experience in this context. Now, moving on to the central part of, or one of the central parts of this chapter, let's move to the triple S model: self, soul, and spirit. We will begin our voyage here by analyzing critical neuroscience, yet again, as a direct heir of epistemology and heuristics. Now, we mentioned this in the context of Aristotelian episteme, techne, and phronesis. So if the question is, in week 13 and 14, toward the end of this semester, what is critical neuroscience? What does it do? Well, critical neuroscience has the duty to investigate the fallacies such as deriving, please pay attention, a prescription for a pure description. Critical neuroscience, yet again, has the duty to investigate the fallacies such as deriving a prescription for a pure description, or in general, deriving prescription from pure description. This is a quote by Moore. And this, again, is a core concept of the course. More than the idea that I would like to bring to your attention is that science cannot and should not be separated from considerations that are usually connected to philosophy, ethics, and even spirituality, metaphysics, considerations around what should we do, what is the proper way to exist, how can we develop empathy, how can we develop love. Now, the link between pure description, and what our mind and soul really are, or what our brain should do, is at the center of deriving prescription for pure description. This is the same problem we encounter in week 4 and 5. Just by observing things, we cannot necessarily infer what those things are in a deeper sense, what they should do. Now, this is not to say that, similar to what we seen in discussing Thomistic philosophy, that through the book of nature, so through the analysis of neuroanatomy, structure, function, fMRI, we could not find the book of God, so to speak, because if there is a God, if there is a divine presence in the world, well, it's fair to assume, and the reason why this is fair, it was already analyzed in previous weeks, that the language is the language of nature. Science and divine elements, scientific method and spirituality should not fight against one another because they come from the same source. That's the whole idea. but we cannot simply infer that our sheer observation and pure observation alone can tell us about this inner nature of things, the inner essence of things. And this is what brings us to the suggestion here, the triple S model that this chapter presents. The triple S indicates the initials of self, soul, and spirit, starting with an examination of the clinical context. What does it mean to apply neuroscience to better understand the mind-body connection in these three areas, to understand ourself, our soul, and our spirit? It's a tripartite component of our existential experience, and we mentioned this number 3 several times in this course. And some of the images that we'll present to you here as part of this video, some of them are included in the textbook, some instead are brand new, and you can only find it in this video, have to do with this element of 3 from a philosophical and even theological perspective. I will make sure to provide you with multiple examples from monotheistic sources as well as polytheistic sources, spirituality, philosophy, and religion in general. So imagine this 3 model, the tripartite component of our existential experience could be viewed in this way. So there are 3 ways to describe and define human experience. Experience as individual, an individual experience, or subjectively understood. Experience as transcendental or internally felt. And finally, experience as metaphysical or divinely inspired. Now, in the textbook, you'll see that it's always and or because of the needed clarity here. And this is because there are multiple ways to interpret that, but those 3 areas are the ones that we should always take into account to better understand the mind-body problem. Okay, so an individual experience, a transcendental experience, and a metaphysical experience, they have to do with the 3 elements. You could say they have to do with spirit, body, and mind. They have to do with self, soul, and spirit, and they have to do with understanding, thinking about cognition in a subjective sense. They have to be connected to feelings and emotions internally, right? And have to be connected to the divine breath, we could say. We mentioned this in week 2 and 3 regarding the élan vital or the bios, vis, the ruach in Semitic languages, Geist or ghost, and spiritus, right? Inspiration, the breath of life, the Atman, okay, the metaphysical, the element that goes beyond the physical. Now, how can we better understand this framework? Okay, because there are 3 elements, okay, and we have to better define what self, soul, and spirits are. And I always suggest students to start with an etymological analysis. Sorry, got a little stuck there. What does it mean self? What does it mean soul? What does it mean spirit? And the framework that we use is critical by definition. Okay. We don't want to just push this idea, but it's critical in that it examines the first level of data collection from experimental studies in neuroscience. Okay, so you have to understand what the science tells us because you have solid scientific evidence in front of you. Data collection from experimental studies as the first level. The second level of scientific and philosophical interpretation, which in modernist times, in a positivistic sense, in materialistic sense, is really mechanical, process-based, as well as solidly mathematical, statistical, epidemiological. And the third level is actually the direct implication for the life lived. So I really want to stress this for students that might be to some extent intimidated by the depth of knowledge required to understand empirical sciences, hard sciences, on top of the complexity of our philosophical discussion throughout the course. The third element is your experience, is the way you exist in the world, the way you feel the connection between your mind and your body. just because you might not have an academic training quite yet, you could say, this does not nullify or invalidate the way you feel your body, as well as the way you feel about your body, the way you feel your soul, as well as the way you feel about your soul. In this regard, again, the connection and the importance of your heart, your being in the right place, having your heart in the right place, validating your experience. I want to mention what we discussed a few weeks ago regarding the contrast between liberal studies and STEM fields, and the fact that certain social sciences, think about psychology for instance, have been criticized for lack of scientific depth or application of a scientific method. And I want to mention a quote by Stephan Schleim that describes the possible outcomes of a moral discourse originating in a philosophical assumption deprived of philosophical understanding. Okay? Because that's the idea. Very often, certain scientists assume that they know enough of philosophy, but the contrary is not necessarily true. That philosophers don't know enough about science, and philosophy here is, to some extent, stretched into including the social science perspective. So this is, this philosophical assumption deprived of philosophical understanding applies specifically to modern neuroscientific research. Quote by Schleim, generations of anthropologists and moral psychologists before had gathered evidence on the development, cognitive, emotional mechanisms, and cultural diversity of morality, but suddenly in 2001, with the publication of the first neuroimaging experiments, the situation seemed to have changed. It seems fair to say that of the 7 different psychological, neuroscientific, theoretical accounts of morality, distinguished by Horgmol et al., all the evidence gathered hitherto does not unequivocally favor any particular one. While the science communication accompanying the original study by Green et al. Suggested the philosophical relevance of the research, even putting forward the idea that the new finding could make moral philosophers superfluous, so far the opposite has been the case. Theoreticians of all kinds responded to the prescriptive normative claims and emphasized how these neuroscientific reports rely on theoretical presumptions and individual interpretation. While theoretical in its scope, moral neuroscience is used to provide the ultimate answers of human right and wrong that Sperry and Gazzaniga called for. More applied technical implications are promised by the complementary research that might be called immoral neuroscience, the investigation of what makes us behave immorally or criminally. And this is connected to moral neuroscience, which is a subfield and a sub-theoretical framework which can be applied to many other fields in neuroscience and to science in general. So this is, again, the connection of the disconnection. How neuroscience alone can provide empirical evidence, observational one, but before we make any ethical moral judgment, we have to be extremely careful. So the right implication of a moralizing neuroscience in those areas where medicine intersects and interests with ethics, morality, as well as advanced directives and the life decisions, it's important to discuss the application of such ethical aspects as found in acute care settings. And in this will be discussed in the second part of this subchapter in this part of the book. So one of the things to keep in mind is that end-of-life decisions should be made once the patient autonomy is assessed, thus determining a series of consideration, including the broader conceptual umbrella of good and evil category, particularly good life versus good death. And I will leave up to the students to review this part of the chapter, but keep in mind that the very term euthanasia assumes that etymological connection. Euthanasia as good death. So who decides what goodness is in this context? And how does this goodness, quote unquote, depend from above? What is the aboveness? We will return to this term later on. And how can advanced directives reflect that? Now, conceptual issues regarding autonomy, consent, and personhood are, for instance, addressed by Coleman in 2013, when discussing yet another philosophical concept, the harm principles connected to John Stuart Mill. In fact, utilitarian principles are in place in analyzing physicians' attitudes toward clinical decisions within advanced directives. And even more so, this is connected to a delicate balance between autonomy and self-determination, which is again important from the perspective of free will. Now, to provide an example here, in connection to not just neuroscience, but to medicine and nursing, Aiken mentions beneficence, justice and fidelity, self-determination and autonomy, full disclosure and veracity, informed consent and privacy and confidentiality. Please review this in the textbook, also because this is connected to Kohlberg's theory of moral development, particularly the third level for morality, from heteronomous to universal. And these considerations are connected to, yet again, philosophy and psychology. Think about Maslow, particularly in the observation by Thielke, Hermeneutics, Thompson, and Patel, that refer to being an expert and competent medical professional means, again, think of what we said about expert, experience, expertise. So being an expert means A, to be able to meet their full potential, self-actualization, B, to feel competent with strong self-esteem, self-perception, and self-worth, esteem, and finally, C, to feel psychologically and professionally supported in the system, love and belongingness. So, as you can see here, even from an evolutionary perspective, what is good for us, what it makes us good in terms of mind and body, this connection is good for society as a whole, for the community.
Fantastic. That concludes week 13th. We will continue our discussion with the second part of chapter 7 next week. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you all next time. Bye-bye.